Welcome. I'm Dr. Frank A. Thomas, and it is my privilege to share with you another fabulous version of the African American Preaching Legacy Series, where we bring you the very best of African American preaching. And I am just so excited because we have a trailblazer, a Bible scholar, a writer, a theologian, a woman of God, a great preacher with us, Dr. Renita Weems, and I am so excited. We've got years of relationship. We've walked some bridges, burned some bridges. We've done a lot of things together, and I'm excited to have you, and thank you so much for taking this time.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
And I just want to get right into it. I want to open up the space for you just to talk to us. And so tell us, for anybody, the few people who may not know who Dr. Renita Weems is, tell us what you would like that person to know.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. Where I would begin would be, I think I want to begin when I went away to become a seminarian at Princeton Seminary. And that was in 1980, January 1980. My call was that spring of 79. And now as I look back on it, all I knew was preaching. All I understood this call to be was a call to be a preacher. But life is lived going forward, but you really only understand it when you look back, says Kierkegaard. So now I will look back and say, I think I was called to a religious vocation, and that preaching was one of them. Yes. But because I'm Protestant, Black Southern Protestant, all I knew was preaching. And so I went off to seminary in 1980 to Princeton Seminary, and there I was an MDiv student at Princeton, but eventually became fascinated with the Old Testament because, and I always say, I might have gotten a PhD in theology if the theology professor had been great. I could have gotten a PhD in ethics if the ethics professor had been great. But it was the master teaching of Bernhard Anderson, and that the Old Testament came alive. And yes, I was an African Methodist Episcopal, and yes, I was seeking ordination in the AME church. But I also knew that if I accepted that becoming pastor, chances are I was going to not get a church. Or if I got a church, it would be a tiny little church in the country. And I wanted something more. So I indeed went through the African Methodist ordination process, and I'm grateful for that. I was in what we call the first district, which is New Jersey. And in addition to becoming an ordained minister, a clergywoman, a preacher, I also ultimately entered into a PhD program because I also realized that there was a call on me to become an academic, a scholar in particular, and a writer. So the religious vocation, clergy, scholar, writer, public thinker, was ultimately, now I understand now, is what my calling really was. In 1979, when I heard God on that Sunday afternoon there in New York at a meeting, and it was not even the 11 o'clock service, it was the afternoon service. And I fleeced God and said, God, if this is really you, make it plain. And it became plain. And my life, a new life, because I had been a stockbroker with Merrill Lynch. And I had also wanted to be a writer in New York. And those things, well, the stockbroker thing did work out, but I hated it. And becoming a writer in New York did not work out in the way that I wanted. And from that moment in 1980, God did some wonderful and marvelous things in my life.
So tell me of those wonderful and marvelous things.
Well, becoming the first Black woman to receive a PhD in Old Testament and Hebrew Bible. Now, I never talk about that. I never talk about being the first Black woman because I don't you're not trying to be the first black woman. You're just trying to get through a PhD program. And then you discover, you mean there are no other black women? How was I supposed to know that? No one sets out, you don't wake up one day and say, I want to be the first. Now, some people do, but I'm not. And a whole lot of us who are trailblazers, legends, first and out, we just wanted to answer a call. Yeah. And, but I want to say here, and I think it's important because I've written a chapter in a book on Katie Cannon. Mm-hmm. Katie Cannon in 1974 entered Union Seminary with the hope of having a PhD in Old Testament. She did not go to Union Seminary in 1974 to become an ethicist. She would go on to become the founder, the mother, first wave womanist, black womanist Christian ethicist, with first black woman for a PhD in ethics. But she came to Union Seminary in 1974, having been accepted into the Bible department. And because of the racism and sexism that she encountered there, was ultimately booted out of that program and found her way over to ethics. I am the first to graduate with a PhD in Old Testament. Katie Cannon, Dr. Katie Cannon was the first to enter into a PhD program. So let's get the history right. So I think that that's important to say. Just because you are the first one at something, to achieve it, you're not the first one to attempt it. Yes. And Katie Cannon, as a black woman, was the first one in 74, but it would be 1989 when I finished that I would be the first one to earn a PhD in Old Testament.
So you said God has done amazing things. So after you finished, give me the next.
The next iteration of myself would then become a professor at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. A junior professor, first black woman, certainly at the Divinity School, not in the university, but certainly in the Divinity School. And all that means when you are a junior professor and you're the first, and all of the challenges. One of the wonderful things I have to give Vanderbilt credit for is that we agreed early on that I would teach, not electives, but the foundation courses, which means everyone had to go and attend Dr. Weems' class. Because sometimes as black faculty, we can be shuttled off to electives or courses where students have to choose, but they are not required to take. So this is 1989, 1990. So I am a junior professor teaching students who had never had a black woman professor. And all of that meant, and all of the challenges of just being a junior professor. But I did ultimately become tenured at Vanderbilt, wrote some books, Listening for God, Battered Love, and a number of other books there, again, in terms of the ways in which God opened doors for me. And all of that meant to be the first. That means that there are demands upon you. There are demands of students. There's the demand of the institution. There is, being the face of the institution and a number of things. It means invitations come in from across the country and you having to make some wise decisions. And you don't always make wise decisions in those early years. So the cost of all of that is enormous. So there have been blessings and there's certainly been burdens of being the first and the only for a number of years.
Yes. I think I want to come back to the first and the only, but I want to take me to how you got to walk in to Princeton Seminary.
You mean my choice?
Call.
The call, yes. Well, I'm an Old Testament professor, so I know about these call narratives, And I always say to students, there's what you say on Sunday, and then there's what you say on Monday.
Right.
So on Sunday, I'm supposed to tell you, God called me. I was sitting there. As the Pentecostal song says, I wish you could have been there when I came through. The church was on fire with the Holy Ghost, too. I remember the day and I remember the hour when the Lord saved me. I know what I'm supposed to say on Sunday, okay? The call narrative. Renita was sitting somewhere in 1979. Okay, yes, there is that. But then on Monday, I'm supposed to say, Well, you see, I was a stockbroker, and I was broke, and I needed some money. And Princeton was giving PhDs, or Princeton was certainly. Princeton was on the northeast corridor. I wanted to stay on the northeast corridor. I did not want to leave I-95, and I could have chosen to go on to Emory, and I could have chosen to go on to Vanderbilt, but I chose Princeton because it was on the East Coast. Now let's talk about the human side of our call.
Yes.
And the godless side of our call.
Yes.
Now, ultimately, there is a God who laughs. You know, we make plans and God laughs. Isn't that what the saying says?
Yes.
So yes, I had some choice. I love. There's a book by Kurt Byron Jones. It was called Holy Play. And he says that God does give us some options. God says, now choose. Whether you choose Old Testament or New Testament ethics or pastoral care. You don't have to sit around and say, God, which discipline? Or even, God, should I get a PhD in Bible or law? God says, choose, right, and I'll be with you. And so I chose Hebrew Bible, and ministry chose me, and I chose it. And I chose it. And students who have heard me speak say, I often use the expression because it seemed like a good idea at the time. It brought together a number of things, the side of me that wanted to write, the side of me that loved God and wanted to live for God, and the side of me that was certainly an intellectual. And I came to ministry, and ministry did not teach me how to ask questions. I came to ministry because I asked questions, because I was curious. I was always peeping behind curtains. I was always lifting up the communion cloth to see what's really under there, or the men who used to hold the communion cloth, the deacons who used to hide what was going on. I was always the child that wanted to know, well, what was going on the other side. So ministry became my way of asking those kind of questions.
So tell me about Bishop John Bryant.
Yes, that was an impactful time in my life. I went away to college in 1972, and at that time, John Bryant, who in some ways I would consider at least one of my fathers in the ministry. I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, in a little storefront AME church, a Kojic Church, Church of God in Christ. Bishop Elder Bradley was my bishop when I was in high school. I did not know the Lord before high school. My father remarried, and my stepmother introduced us to church and took us all in an old station wagon to a Church of God in Christ church. When I went away to college in 1972, I went to Cambridge, Massachusetts. I went to Wellesley, and St. Paul AME Church sent a bus out. You know, those are the days when churches would send buses out to get the college students. And they would send this bus out. And I used to go to St. Paul. And there I encountered a preaching and a church that was different from my home church in Atlanta, the little small storefront Church of God in Christ church that nurtured my soul. And once I got to St. Paul in Cambridge, it nurtured my mind, my heart, and my soul, because at St. Paul, under John Bryant and Cecilia Bryant, three things came together, I think. A kind of neo-charismatic worship, which was reminiscent of my Kojic background, but also a kind of Pan-Africanism. I believe John Bryant had recently been in the Peace Corps in Liberia. And he was certainly a child of the Black student protest movement and Black theology. So there was Pan-Africanism, there was neo-charismatic worship, and a kind of Black theology, Black liberation preaching that attracted scores of us from around the city. And I had never had that. And I think that was my first time hearing a preacher who brought all those things together, and a brilliant wife. His wife was not in ministry at the time, but Cecilia Bryant was unlike any other woman I had ever met. She was African through and through. brilliant woman with a master's in political science from Boston University. So I'd never seen a clergy couple so powerful, so articulate, so visionary, so charismatic. And for me, that was life-changing as well, because I saw a brilliant woman who was the pastor's wife, but even aside from being the pastor's wife, she was just brilliant. So she brought together intellect and spirituality. Mm-hmm. That was impactful. At that point, neither one of us were in ministry. We were not women in ministry at that time. We were just smart church women, yeah. Intellectually powerful women in church leadership. And she introduced me to that. She saw something in me and said, why don't you go do this? And would you help me do that? And little did I know she was mentoring me. But mind you, this is a woman who was herself at the time. If I'm 18, she was 27, 28. So we're not talking about women who were my age. Right. So we were inventing a trail, creating a trail, and being a trail at the same time. And John Bryant's ministry, myself and a number of us were very much shaped by that. Mm-hmm. And from there, I graduated. I would graduate from college, become a public accountant, and then become a stockbroker, and from there, and then a writer, and then from there into ministry.
We've had some of this conversation already, so tell me about some of the folks who came out of Bishop John and Cecilia Bryant's ministry there in Cambridge.
Well, you couldn't be in the Cambridge area and not attend St. Paul, whether you joined it officially like some of us, or whether you just dropped by and just enjoyed great singing, hand clapping, Afrocentric preaching, Pan-Africanist kind of theology and preaching and worship. But certainly Ron McNair, the late Ron McNair, who was a part of the Challenger that exploded. Ron was a member there at the time and taught karate to children there at St. Paul. He was a student at MIT, I believe in astrophysics, whatever it is that you do, whatever you major in to become an astronaut. So Ron was there, Gwen Eiffel was there, Julianne Malbo certainly was there. Ultimately, Congressman Floyd Flake was a dean at Boston University. He would come through there. He was very much so. He and John Bryant became very close friends. A number of people who I know were women who went on to have be the first PhDs in literature and in history, who were studying at Harvard and BU and other places. We were there at 19, 20, 30, 31, 35 years old in the Cambridge area as students. Yes. And we all came through St. Paul AME Church.
This is for, that's a trailer we just did. So we have an interview with Bishop John Bryant. You should check that interview out. It's a fabulous interview, and it will bless you. So tell me about some of the other mothers and fathers that shaped you as you were growing to become Dr. Renita Weems.
Well, there were the preachers who I heard when I was at the Pentecostal Church in Atlanta. And then there would be preachers that John Bryant brought to St. Paul. And then there would be preachers once I moved to New York, the churches that I attended there. So beginning when I was in high school, I only heard one woman preaching. She was evangelist Juanita Sapp. And she was these were traveling evangelists. She was a young woman. She had to be in her 20s, and I'm 16, 17, 18. And as we would say, she was just going forth, and that's a forth with a F-O-R-T-H. So we're talking about King James, going forth. Just a tremendous preacher. I don't remember the sermons, but I just remember seeing a young woman preaching. And this was revival. So if you're talking about Kojic, you're talking about revivals. We're not talking about Sunday morning. So you've got 5 days to study, to watch, to be in awe. And I remember that John Bryant brought a couple of women to St. Paul who I had never heard women preach. and this would be Mary Watson Stewart, Reverend Mary Watson Stewart from Detroit, and Reverend Nurjan Govan, I believe was another woman who was up and these were women, these were AME women. These are women who are, were older than me and who were just powerful orators who stood with their confidence. Dr. Mary Watson Stewart with her hat on, sometimes she would wear a robe, but Mother would have that hat on and be just a preaching and in heels and oh my God, all of that was very just impactful to see these women. Later on, I would say, if I had to say who influenced me, who were the ones, there are those who just stood there as women preachers and, you were in awe. But then there are women whose preaching itself impact you for any number of reasons. And I would have to name women like then evangelist Jacqueline McCullough, one of the first ones I heard, and serious, powerful preacher. My first exposure to an Old Testament scholar. That's who I really learned to hear preach Old Testament. She knew stories in the Old Testament that I had never heard of. I mean, every time I would hear her preach, I would have to go back and find this story. This is long even before I became an Old Testament professor. This woman knew her knowledge of the Hebrew Bible. So that was Evangelist Jackie McCullough. There was Reverend Dr. Audrey Bronson in Philadelphia, with a family of brothers by the name of Bronsons, I gather, who are some theological scholars and pastoral scholars themselves. There was my dear friend who was a student with me at Princeton at the time, although she was ahead of me, was Reverend Prathia Hall. Prathia and I were classmates at Princeton at the same time, although she was a little ahead of me. Well, she was ahead of me in terms of classes. She was light years ahead of me in terms of her vocation, her sense of calling, her having been shaped by SNCC, her work in SNCC there in Albany, her understanding of herself as a Baptist woman. Prathia was the foremost black woman preacher in the 80s and 90s. She spoke at everybody's pulpit. Charles Adams was her best friend. Jeremiah Wright, out at Allen Temple in Oakland, J. Alfred Smith, Prathia for the Progressive and the National Baptist, Hampton, Prathia Hall. These are, so hearing Prathia was the first social justice woman preacher that I heard, just to call the women's names anyway. So Prathia Hall, Reverend Audrey Bronson, I won't forget Arlene Chern, let me mention Arlene Chern in New Jersey, who she was a firecracker. Oh God, she was a firecracker. There was no one like Arlene Chern. I had the good pleasure to hear these women early on, and we're talking about early 80s. In the 80s, before there was anything called womanism or womanist interpretation. They stood flat-foot and preached the unadulterated word of God. And they were tremendous, impactful women. And these are just, I'm sure later on I may think of some others, but those are the ones I certainly want to call their names.
Tell me about Reverend Dr. Elaine Flake and the Women's Conference that you were at last week, I think.
Yeah, before I say that, let me say that 50 years, maybe 100 years from now, church historians will be writing about what happened in the 70s, that a critical mass of women and critical mass of black women began to go into ministry. There have always been women in ministry. Reverend Ella Mitchell was a woman in ministry. Bishop Ida Robinson, the founder of the Mount Sinai Holy Church of America in the 40s, was a woman in ministry. Jarena Lee was a woman in ministry. Reverend Paulie Murray in the Episcopal Church, Barbara Harris, were women in ministry. But something did happen at the late 70s. And that would be that we're talking about. I do not subscribe to the great woman theory, no more than any of us should be subscribed to what we call the great man theory, that Martin Luther King just emerged because he was a great man. We are a product of our context and our era, and there are certain socio-political forces and movements that took place that gave birth to us. I am a product of the women's movement and the Black Power movement. And it's out of that Black women in the 1970s began, as a result of having participated, and I'm younger than that generation, but there's a reason that in this 1970, something came together for women, but especially Black women in the church, in the academy, in professions. Barbara Jordan, Shirley Chisholm runs in 1972. And it was coming out of both the Black Power movement and the women's movement. I have to say that. So when we talk about that critical mass of us, so whether it's Bishop Vashti, whether it's Reverend Cecilia Bryant, whether ultimately becomes Reverend Elaine Flake, whether it is Prathia Hall, I could just, Reverend Kelly Brown Douglas, when you began to name those of us who started entering ministry, Katie Cannon, Jacqueline Grant, Dolores Weems, you began to look at the emergence and the God. I mean, after this, I'm going to say, well, why didn't I call so-and-so's name? But I'm just saying all of us who started coming into ministry. And my friend, I cannot say this without saying, my friend, Carolyn Knight, Yolande Heron Palmore. It was Yolande Heron Palmore who introduced me to Union Seminary. She went to Wellesley with me. Well, I went to Wellesley. She was I've already told you, when you get my age, you got a lot of stories. So you can't just ask me and I have you a little popcorn answer. I can't give you that. You got to know, I always say to people when I preach, you want a verse, but you don't know the chapter. You don't know the chapter because you don't know the book. And you don't know the book because you don't know the Bible. But you want me to tell you all of this in 5 minutes. Right. So I'm trying to say that that something happened in the 70s, that a critical mass of women enter into a number of professions, and ministry is just one. Now we could say God called women in the 70s. Yes, but there were some socio-political forces that also made it possible for us to say, yes, God has been calling, but it was something happened in the late 70s. So Yolande and were students at Wellesley. 1 year, she was from Spelman. She was up at Union. She was up at Wellesley. What happened? We graduated. I connected with her in New York, and she was at this place called Union Seminary. I had graduated from Wellesley. I was in New York trying to make a living as a writer. And I said, well, what is Union Seminary? And I went up to visit her at Union Seminary. And I had never heard of seminary. I knew nothing about Union, and I knew nothing about seminary. And that is where I learned about a professional study for ministry. Little did I know, as I teased her about being a woman in ministry in 1977, that I ultimately in 79 would enter into ministry. And so those years so as a result of that, once women began to get into ministry, but not only in ministry, just began to assume leadership in churches, there was something in about the late 70s, I think, that came about was what I call, and someone else may call it something different who are historians, the Black Church Women's Conference movement. The earliest one that I know about was Cecilia Bryant's women's conference that she held in the Baltimore area. By that time she and John had moved down to Bethel, which she started in about 79. And by 1981, 82, 83, a number of other churches around the country would begin to have Black church women's conferences. And what made these different were that they were interdenominational. They crossed denomination, they cut cross churches. So they were not just Baptist women were meeting, or Methodist women were meeting, or Pentecostal women. Last week, I had the privilege of being a part of the closing session of the Allen AME Church in Queens, New York. Dr. Margaret Elaine Flake, who's now the senior pastor there, this year would be her last year as the pastor of Greater Allen. But 41 years ago, she had her first women's conference, Black Christian Women's Conference. 41 years ago. Is it Eugene Peterson who says, a long obedience in the same direction? The long obedience in the same direction of 41 years of having women's conferences. That is where I cut my teeth on preaching to women, preaching about women. All my favorite sermons on women in the Bible, I first tested at conferences like those. It was not black pulpits, it was not male pulpits. It was at women's conferences and across the country. That started there in about the latter part of the 70s. There were always women's conferences, but these in particular. And that's where I and a lot of us cut our teeth on preaching to women, preaching about women, deconstructing and demythologizing patriarchy. That's where it was safe to do because we had a female audience. And then we went over to the church and began to do that. But it was in those kinds of settings. And so 41 years later, her conference ends because she retires. But I worry that 50 or 100 years from now, Woman Thou Art Loose kinds of conferences will overshadow, that people will write about what, no disrespect to Bishop Jakes, tremendous work, tremendous ministry, but women have been doing these conferences long before his became the commercial success that it became. But at its height, I believe that the Allen Women's Conferences was over 2,000. Ebenezer's conference there in D.C., other conferences across the country. But history will only talk about how Jakes produce, or various male men produce these great women's conferences. But black women, in terms of the black church, have been doing these conferences long before, even Bishop Ernestine Weems. And I believe you've had some Bishop Cynthia James to talk about Ernestine Weems, again, another one of those women who I heard very early and who would have women's conferences as well. Women from all denominations would attend. So Ernestine Weems within the Kojic Church was always already doing some of this work. And that needs to be said that we have, and it needs to be said that it is in those places where I certainly and many of us cut our teeth on preaching, and preaching womanist, woman-centered, women-liberating sermons.
Well, thank you for, which is part and parcel of why we do this African American Preaching Legacy series, because you're dropping breadcrumbs that maybe someone will pick up because you dropped it.
Pick up and do a doctoral dissertation on it.
Right, it's worth
Absolutely. This is history.
Yes.
And this material is archived, is available for the inquiring mind.
Yes, and I just believe someone will. I believe someone will watch this and it'll light a fire and light a spark. Yes. So thank you. So. Yeah, I just believe it because, of course, our passions get ignited because we hear people such as yourself who recite the history, and it's like, I need to follow up on that. So
yes, absolutely.
I definitely believe that will occur. So I love your preaching. So how would you define your preaching method?
Well, when I was younger, when I was first entering ministry, I was a preacher who happened to be a scholar. 40 years later, I'm a scholar who happens to preach. I know this series is important to you, but I don't see myself as a preacher. I know this is all about preaching. Right. And I love preaching. I love hearing preaching. I do not enjoy preaching, but I preach because that is what my church understands. But that is not my sole identity or how I see myself. But as I said earlier, I know I'm called to the religious vocation, and preaching is one of the things that I do. Right. So, and because we are in an era, we're moving into an era where people are bivocational, where people beginning to see themselves larger than just one thing. Maybe this interview will be helpful to them, for me to be able to say that God calls us to do a number of things, and preaching is one form of communication.
Exactly.
Writing is another form of communication. Exactly. Teaching is another form of the religious vocation. Yes. Preaching is a particular kind that has a tradition that is wonderful, but it is one form of communication. But it is not the only form. If God called me to be a communicator,
say I'm with you 100%.
God called me to proclaim. Yes. And preaching from a pulpit in a formal setting is one way to do that.
Yes, 100% agree that I'm a communicator, and preaching is one of the forms I communicate in. 100%, 100%. Now, as good as those sermons are, you're not just throwing that stuff together. There's a method here. I'm gonna go back to it. So do you have, a method, dialectical method? You mean none of those may fit what you do. So just tell me about it.
Well, I am not a homiletician. I did not get a PhD in homiletics. Okay. So I'm a gumbo preacher, okay. All right? So you asked me about my roux. Right. You asked me about my roux. So, I throw a little bit of this, and I throw a little bit of that, and but you do have to have a good roux about you, right? And roux takes a little time to brown with that flour and that oil. So I do have a kind of a sense of something that I want to start with. My challenge is that for someone like you with your program, okay, am I narrative? Am I expositor? Am I topical? I want you to know I went online last night to figure out what those terms mean so that I would sound intelligent this morning, narrative. Okay, am I a narrative? Am I expositor? Am I textual? Am I, what is, I don't know. So I just want you to know, I did my homework. I do know those terms. I was prepared. I wanted the scholar who's prepared. Right. I know Hebrew Bible. I don't know everything. Right. Okay. I don't know preaching. But that said, let me just also say who I have not said was probably my greatest influence, not because I preach like him, but because the person who made me, Toni Morrison is the writer I wanted to be like. And I mean, I wanted to write novels like Toni Morrison. I wanted to write sentences like Toni Morrison. Gardner Taylor was the preacher I wanted to preach like. I wanted to preach sentences like Gardner Taylor. That's important to know in terms of the person who could always make me weep. Yeah. In terms of the person, a great writer, if you are aspiring to be a writer, is someone who writes and whose sentence makes you wish you had written that sentence. Not just that book, but that sentence. And Lot's wife looked back and she became a pillar of salt. That was one of those sentences that said, now I can go with that. I can preach that. So I'm saying that all of that to say that for me, preaching begins with a sentence. It's always begun. And that's the writer in me. That's the writer in me that used to write for Essence Magazine. And Essence Magazine says, this is a great article, but our readers, that first paragraph must get the reader. Otherwise, on a New York subway, as they hold Essence Magazine and they're holding the strap to the subway, you've got to make them want to read the second paragraph. Right. I probably put more time into my first paragraph than I do the rest of the sermon. And it's the writer in me. I must hook. And if I can hook myself, I can hook other people. Right. And I think in that hook tells you where I want to go, even if I don't get there. Right. So I spent a lot on the beginning, which is why my endings are always weak, because I love the beginnings. And I need a great sentence, and I need a great thought. If I preach, and if I am a great preacher, Frank, whatever that means, I think I preach great questions. I must have a question. What am I asking? What am I concerned about? What is it that's, why do the righteous suffer? What is, God, where are you? Those are my kind of questions. Those are the kind of questions I'm interested in. So something, that you find in Job, the wrestling with God. Not just about suffering, but just wrestling with God. And I think that's why I chose, and why Hebrew Bible, Paul says, to lay hold of that which laid hold of me. The Hebrew Bible laid hold on me because that for me is where the great questions are raised by the prophets. Why, how long, how could you? If you are God, then I was interested in those kind of questions. And I think my sermons are my way of doing some of that same theological work of asking, what if? I preached a sermon recently that a number of people write me about, and I preached it at Alfred Street Baptist Church.
Howard John Wesley.
Yes, Howard John Wesley. It was called Where? Over There. And I preached about when God says to Moses, go forward, tell the people to go forward. And you're like, well, where is that? And sometimes you don't know where that is. It's just not where you are right now. I'm fascinated with those kinds of sermons, that kind of preaching, that kind of theological process. So I began with a question. I began with something I want to unravel. And I think that preaching, and this may be a little heretical in given what you're doing in this process. My biggest challenge with my students who I've taught preaching, or I've taught preaching to, or I've taught Bible to, I'd say, you think that it is so mystical. You think it is something that you just kind of sit before God and say, give me a sermon, and you think it just drop out of the sky. But it does draw on some of the same skills that a writer uses. And that is, you begin with a problem. You begin with something you want to explore. Preaching is just, and it's so demoralizing to preachers because they want to believe that they do something that only they do. But it requires some of the same skills. It does. And those skills of asking questions, those skills of honing and a particular question that you're trying to ask. And so for me, when I am about to preach, I need a good question. I need a good text. My husband often says, your problem is that you start your question and you go to find your scripture. I start with a scripture and find me a question. I'm like, is that right? I like to start with a question and then to help find a scripture that kind of comes out of that. And I'm beginning, and I want to know, as I say to students, all preaching is polemical. Mm-hmm. What are you trying to argue? We're not here to do a survey of the book of Jeremiah. All preaching is polemical. All preaching has a thesis. All preaching has something, as they say, something. What you want them to do? What do you want them to believe? What do you want to change? I don't want to do a survey. People are bored with your surveys. And so therefore, I'm arguing for something. Right. And preaching is arguing for something. Or it's not, or what's the point? Why should I come every Sunday if you have no point? And so I'm always looking. So therefore, hermeneutics involves some of the hermeneutical steps. What is this text arguing? Who is Jesus debating with? Who is Paul contending with? Who is Jeremiah's audience? Who is Moses' audience? I'm interested in the power dynamics within a text. We might see that as reading behind the text, reading against the grain of the text. That might be called liberation preaching. It might be called post-colonial. There is the text. There is the world behind the text. And then there's the world in front of the text. Ultimately, I want to get to the world in front of the text, meaning what do the contemporary audiences interested in? But I'm also interested in, and I must ask the question of the world behind the text. But we are living in a generation where there are people who do not know this text. And they may not even be interested in the world behind the text. Right. They are very interested in the world in front of the text. But my integrity as a Bible scholar means that I must ask the questions behind it, I must ask the questions about it, and then I must ask the questions in front of it. That is the hermeneutical circle: behind, in, and in front of. Those are my 3 steps that I'm involved in, even if you don't always hear it in the sermon. Right. Because we do more research than we can really proclaim when it's, but you ought to get up and preach as though you have done that research and ask those questions. Right. Yeah.
One of the reasons that I love your preaching so much is that you're willing to preach what Frederick Beecher calls the presence and the absence of God. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And you're willing to struggle with both. That's the tension that you were talking about. Mm-hmm. I also think it lands you squarely in what Edgar Trey Clark may call the Black contemplative preaching tradition. Mm. He has a new book about to come out on the Black contemplative preaching tradition. Mm-hmm. But a lot of what we do, I believe, because African Americans are a traumatized people, that we don't like to talk about the absence of God. We want to talk about God's present, God's full. So for me, on Good Friday, for example, and we've all done it, you preach Good Friday services, you get 7 sermons. In the majority church, they go out sad, they turn the lights down, they go out silent, as Jesus is still on the cross. Easter ain't come, right? We go to Easter on Good Friday.
Yes, we already.
Because we've already been a traumatized people. And to sit in the spaces of the absence of God when you pray and there's no answer, or the way that I say it is that we like to preach, train up a child in the way the child will go and the child won't depart thereof. And then your question would be, well, what about when you raise the child but the child departs thereof? Well, and then because they coming back, just wait on them, and we've all done that. But that's why I think I love your preaching. I love the questions. I love the struggle, because I think for me, it's the life that I lead. And a part of my life is the full presence of God. I preach the presence of God. I believe the presence of God. I live, love, long for the presence of God. But sometimes it's the absence. It's the waiting. It's the, you said it one time this way. You said, I think if I get it wrong, you can correct me. You had your mother on the front row, and she's breaking up crackers, going on the floor, and you're preaching the healing of God.
Yes.
And we believe in God's healing, but your mother's sitting there on the front row. I mean, this is the tension that I love in preaching, and I love preachers to give me both sides, wrestle with me, because in my life I'm living the fullness and the presence of God, and the trailblazing and the great things God is able to do. But sometimes I also live the despair, the loneliness, So I think that
right. No, I hear you. I think you're reminding me on my own book, Listening for God, right. Where I'm a minister's journey through silence and doubt. And at the time, I had no idea, Frank, that that book would cause the kind of stir that it did. How can you admit that as a minister you go through periods of doubt? And I thought, don't we all admit that? And evidently, there's something about religion, there's something about Black faith that is about, people come to church and to faith for certitude.
They do.
They come for certitude.
Baldwin calls it safety.
Safety, absolutely. Certitude, safety, surety. He's the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Boy, you want us to shout? We shout on that right there. The same yesterday, and all of that. Okay, and I get it, and I can do that Sunday. But here on another day, as we are talking, he may not come when you want him. In fact, you can just about be assured He won't come when you want him. So I like to go back to your preaching language, your homiletic language. I like to preach the antithesis. Can I say that?
Yes.
I like to preach the antithesis. Some people like there is a style of preaching, I'm told, thesis, antithesis or antithesis, and the synthesis. Am I correct? Is
Yes,
that some style?
that's the relevant question, dialectical method.
Okay.
Proper.
I like the antithesis preaching. I like God is able to rescue us. God will save us from this fire, but if not, I love the preacher who stays there, not the one God is able, not the one and God did. I'm looking for the preacher who says, but if not, now you have me leaning, because that's been my experience. That faith is, can you still believe God, trust God, serve God, believe in God, believe in faith when God does not rescue you from the fiery furnace? When there is no third person in the fire with you, it's just your behind that's in the fire. Okay, now, in my radical big afro days, well, what do I want with that kind of God? Why would you even serve that kind of God? But, you live long enough to know that as Gardner Taylor talks a lot, there are some things you only learn through pain. There's some part of the religious walk of your spiritual journey that you only really grasp, or you only grow in those but if not moments. That I have been a believer. I say in listening for God, I believe in believing even when I can't believe anymore. Mm-hmm. I believe in this journey. I've given my life to this journey, even when it has not turned out the way that I thought. That same girl who sang, I wish you could have been there when I came through, that the church was on fire with the Holy Ghost too. That certitude that I grew up with, that I needed, that you need when you're younger, and then comes life and the reality of life. And to know that that this faith has still sharpened me. It has not proven to be all that I thought it would be, but I wouldn't be where I am now if I had not made this journey and had not walked this walk with God. And it is not unlike the Jewish people who have gone through the Holocaust. What does it mean when, or in the book of Jeremiah and Habakkuk and Lamentations, that when your most cherished traditions fail you, your belief in the inviolability or the invincibility of Jerusalem, or that you are the chosen people, or that if you live right, heaven belongs to you, all of those kinds of things. And one day you realize that it's not that simple, it's not that simplistic, that you can live right and still get cancer, as I did, or your marriage can still fall apart, or you can still lose a child to death, or your country can still be invaded. It does not mean that bad things won't happen to you, as Rabbi Kushner said. And so, do I question God? Yes. But what I also question, Frank, is my theology. That my theology also has to be reframed to say, perhaps, can I live with a God, as we said in a Hebrew Bible class when I was a PhD student, can I live with a God who will walk with me but may not save me, who will be there for me, who cries with me but that does not necessarily deliver me? Now, the radical black power girl with the big afro says, well, why would I want a God like that if God is no more powerful than I didn't say that God wasn't more powerful. Now, the antithesis of even what I've just said is that if I'm questioning that, then I must also question all this language about, won't he do it? Mm-hmm. Didn't he make a way? So if I question this whole question of whether or not I believe in a God who always delivers or does deliver or can deliver or that delivering is even a part of my theology, I must also peep under the covers like Toto in The Wizard of Oz and pull back the curtain and say, this language about the blessings of God, the favor of God, I must also just kind of at least question that. I don't know where I want to go with it. Because believe me, the next time I have cancer, I'm going back to God and praying like that Pentecostal girl, not like the one who's sitting here right now talking to you intellectually. I'm going back, if you are God, God, how could you? God, I'm praying for a miracle. When reality, but in this moment of being theologian to theologian, thinker to thinker, I'm saying it's a lot more complex than our traditions have known how to help us think about without crashing, spiritually crashing.
You know, we had a conversation over here in the car about wailing, about how sometimes in the contemporary church there's not room for wailing because we're assuring, we're lifting the people by what God will and God can and God shall. And I do as much of that as anybody. But I also long for spaces where you don't have it all together. I preached a sermon yesterday. It's called "You Better Get Some for Yourself," and I was talking about the tax collector who stood afar off, beat his chest, and said, "God, forgive me, for I'm a sinner," and how, as clergy and as church leaders, we slide to the Pharisaical side, and we never go to the altar for ourselves. We never are on our face. We lead the people on their face, right? And this whole question of wailing comes, and the wailing wall, and the cry, that the silent desperation that's in the congregation that we, as pastors and shepherds and scholars, we're familiar with. But if we fully released it or allowed it to be released or participated in it so it could be released, we've seemed to go to assurance and safety. And
it is the Job's wife moment. To acknowledge, it is easy, again, that this is the womanist in me, redeeming Job's wife. That I've kind of patriarchal, heteronormative, heteropatriarchal way of looking at it is to silence her. Why don't you just curse God and die? Now that might be stronger than we want to hear, but this woman had lost her children. This woman had not had an experience with God in the same way that Job had. God, Job had, that was between God and Job. Listen, what you're doing with him, it may be one thing, but those are my children.
Right.
She is wailing, she's lamenting, she's angry at God, and she's angry at her husband for still believing in God. That story will cause somebody in the audience say, oh my God, I'm being seen, I'm being heard. And so you can read with the story and read with Job, but then you have to step back and say, there are some other voices in these texts that can help you get at some of the pain that people are living in. And that is the women who feel, and the men who feel like Job's wife. Just curse God and die. Why do you hold on to your faith and your integrity? Just let it go. And to give people models and permission that it's okay, that part of the spiritual journey is to go through that, is to feel that. Hopefully not stay there, but you go through that. So to preach in ways that it is all right if the altar is not flooded with people who are shouting and dancing, but there may be that piercing cry there on the 19th row, and to stand there and sit there and let that cry be the response, or the old deacon over there who's pulled out this big handkerchief and is just crying and weeping. He's embarrassed and he's ashamed, but you brought up, reminded him of his dead wife who's been dead 20 years, or his child, his son who was killed in World War II. And he's just weeping. That those two are acceptable ways of a response to a sermon, is wailing or even just silence. Absolute silence. It's all right to sit down, and there was no shouting, and there was just stunned into quiet. And that too is God. That too should be incorporated as an acceptable. It is not failure. It is not that you flunked. It is that you said all that needed to be said. Yeah. And now let the Holy Spirit do His work.
Yes, in the lives of people.
People, yes.
I want to give you a chance for whatever you would like to say, because probably I'm not smart enough to ask all the questions that need to be asked, or there may be something on your heart that you've been. I don't know. You're free, completely free to share what you'd like to share.
One question that you've not asked me, although we have talked around it and I've tried to incorporate it, is my work as a womanist scholar, being a first generation, being a first wave. I thank you for not calling me the mother of that movement. Auntie, all that language that just makes me wince. But certainly being a trailblazer, it was a radical notion in the 80s. Maybe it means that we've come a long way, but it was a radical notion in the 80s that black women had a right to interpret the Bible, and that black women have had a history of interpreting the Bible, that black women have a right to name God for themselves, to draw on their own experiences, to bring black women's experiences to the fore in their preaching, to not have to use football imagery, to not use imagery about armies and battles and, military imagery, male imagery, patriarchal stories. That this was it may seem commonplace now, but it was not commonplace when we began talking about looking through a different lens. It's not so much a methodology, but it is a different lens. To be able to say that in churches where black women make up 60 to 75% of the congregation, that we should not have had to apologize, but we did. And we had to create language and tools for being able to say, now let's look at this same story from the perspective of women, black women. How would a black woman have interpreted this same story? It may be the same way, but it may not. And it may not only be the same way, different way, but it may be because she is black and female and queer and poor and Southern, that there are intersectional ways in which there are reasons why we interpret the Bible the ways that we do. And I think that period, that moment in history when what we now call identity politics, as though that it's pejorative, that context matters, that the interpreter matters, and that the interpreter, and so I'm a part of, and I'm sure I will be a part of, be known for the fact that I'm a part of a generation of black women scholars, in theological studies at least, who began to say, James Cone has done a great job. Elizabeth Schur-Renser has done a great job in feminist hermeneutics. James Cone has done, et al., and Kane Felder have done a great job with black liberation scholarship. But there's a gap, and the gap only black women can fill and say both and, not either or. And we're all of those things, and we bring all of that to bear. And that has shaped black preaching. The emergence of women in ministry, in preaching, has changed black preaching, because black male preaching is far more transparent than it has ever been. It is more expansive than it has ever been. Men have preached more about women than they would have if black women had not come into ministry. They themselves are more transparent in their preaching, about their preaching in ways. So women, black women and women have certainly made an impact on ministry. Nowhere where we need to be. The church is still firmly in the hands of men. It is still a very patriarchal institution. But black women, preachers, interpreters, scholars, black men going to seminary now and being taught by black women professors, white students being taught by black women professors. We are shaping the next generation. Maybe resistantly, but we are making impact. So my work as a womanist scholar, as a womanist biblical scholar, and the impact it has had on young black preachers who now will contact me and say, Dr. Weems, I remember you as my professor, or I heard you as a preacher, and what you did with that particular text, or any number of us, my other colleagues, Judith Fentress-Williams, Valerie Bridgman, and others across the country who are in Bible, Mitzi Smith, we're making an impact, an important impact as womanist biblical scholars to the preaching profession and as well as to biblical scholarship and to the larger black church. Absolutely. That is a very real reality. And I am proud to be a part of that first wave, if you will, and happy that now I can look and see a second and a third wave of black women in theological scholarship, period, right, which is very important. And I did not mean to do that. I wasn't trying to start a movement. I was just trying to find a place for my voice, as we all were at that point. And then you look up and you realize, you mean this is a movement? You mean this is a discipline? You mean this is an area of study now? But that's not what we were trying to do, but thanks be to God, that is what has happened.
Thank you so much for this tremendously profound wisdom. It's just, I'd love to just sit and let you keep going because it's. You get the feeling I could keep going, don't you? Yeah, I have that feeling. You do. And it'd be all right with me. So no, it would be all right. Yes, it really would, because it's wisdom of ages being shared and expanding worlds and helping me to expand my world. I want to ask you what I think might be my final question about the cost of trailblazing, about what it means to challenge structures and systems, to push against the norm, the societal regression back to traditions of patriarchy and sexism, racism, and all of these things. The ability not to include the LGBTQIA people. I mean, we're going, and you're going uphill, and we don't talk much about the cost. Is there anything you want to say about what it's cost you across the years as you sit now and welcome the third wave and look forward to the fourth wave, and are now, at least for me, sitting in seats of cheerleading and encouraging. So what about the cost? There are so many angles at which I could approach that. So let me see which part of the water I want to swim in. First, the cost of being an unconventional woman. Let's just, before we go to preaching, we go to being a scholar, just being unconventional, just won't behave. Won't be quiet, won't be girly, won't be demure. You have girly moments and you demure every now and then. You know, you don't have something to say about everything. It's just that when you do have something to say, it's disruptive. You didn't mean to be disruptive. I just thought, weren't we talking? I thought we were all talking. But no, I just never
I never caught the cues. I forgot to be quiet. I forgot to not ask the piercing question. You know, I didn't just ask questions. I asked the piercing question. But then I said, what's the problem? I'm in academia. This is where the piercing questions. If I had stayed in the church, if I had stayed in the Methodist church, I would have been defrocked because it can't stand those questions. But I even went into the academy, and there was still a price to be paid to ask in PWI, predominantly white institutions, as a black woman, to ask. And so why are we doing this student one way and another student another way? So why am I being asked to give you my syllabus and they're not being asked those kinds of questions, to be unconventional, to ask the tough questions, and then to be a woman, to be a black woman? So I was already unconventional. That was already a problem. That was a problem before ministry. And then to be in ministry and to be unconventional and to be smart and to be, as Shirley Chisholm says, unbought and unbossed. And it comes with a certain personality. I joke, this is a joke. There's a side of you that has to enjoy a good fight. You just cannot run from fights. So it helps to be your father's daughter. You know, it helps to come from a father who was rambunctious, shall we say. And I look like my mother, but I have my father's personality, which is we're scrappy. And then one day you do ask, as a woman, I don't know if men have to go through this, but as a woman you say, God, give me a sweeter personality. Make me more likable. That is who you are when you're younger. You're asking because you're trying to fit in. You're just trying not to ruffle everybody's feather. You're just trying not to always be the one who walk in the room and the whole temperature changes. You know it. You know that everybody is squirming because you either like Renita or you can't stand Renita. And then one day you're like, this is my superpower. The fact that half of them hate me and half of them love, that is my power. The fact that they don't like me or that they find me problem, or Frank, you're not invited to preach because you just don't know what Renita Weems will say. You're like, that's my superpower. But it takes some time. I hope that younger women get to that sooner, but it takes some time. Now the cost of it is that you don't always have the privilege. You don't always have the privilege to specialize. It's that you're pulled in so many directions. That's the cost. Is that you never necessarily, I didn't have the opportunity to just be a scholar or just be a preacher or just be a writer. I had to do a number of things because our numbers were so small. So I had to be the point guard and the person in the paint, whatever you call that person, the post player, and the center. I had to be the point guard and the center and a shooting guard and the coach, and the water girl. I mean, I had to. When you're the first generation, there's so many people calling upon you. There's so many fires to put out. You sometimes want something gets sacrificed. Your writing gets sacrificed, or your scholarship gets sacrificed, or your teaching gets sacrificed. Something gets sacrificed. So you make an impact, but you write 10 books, but you had 19 in you. And you could have written 19 if you had just been able to just write. But you couldn't. And so the cost is a divided self, and not having your time to yourself, and then also not knowing how to say no until sickness comes, until tragedy happens, and you have breast cancer, and you learn, maybe I need to start scaling back. I need to learn how to say no, and you shouldn't have to get to that place. But I think because of my own also intense personality and all those things, there was a tremendous cost. And the cost is that for every door that was open, there were doors that were closed. And for everyone who said, my God, you blessed me, there were some others who said, how dare she? And for everyone who said yes, there was a no. And for many years, I was hurt when I would hear, you know, they don't ask you because they know that you would, and you know they ask her and not you because they know that you are going to say something about masculinity or patriarchy, and she won't. And that's not to take anything away from her preaching. And then one day you embrace that and say, well-behaved women do not change history. It is the hard-headed ones. It is the ones where you don't know what she will say. And say, that is my superpower, and that is the gift of God, and the ways in which God has used my work and my contribution, not just me. And I'll end with this story. I remember preaching somewhere. And you know how at the end of a sermon, if you're a woman, you end with the Great Hall of Fame. You call out Mary McLeod Bethune, Ida, and just like God was with Sojourner Truth, and just like God was with Rosa Parks, blah, blah, blah. At the end of the sermon, a woman came up to me and said, that was a great Hall of Fame, but you didn't know Mary McLeod Bethune. She was a difficult woman. And I said to myself, thank you, God. I want to be like Mary McLeod Bethune. Because I said to myself, there are a lot of people's names that you call, but if you got to know them, you would discover that to do what they did, you had to be a difficult woman. And you had to make some difficult choices. And you had to do some things that you otherwise may not have wanted to do. And I'm just saying that to say that in order to do this kind of work, you have to be willing to be remembered by some as difficult. And difficult men, difficult women have to make difficult choices in order to change systems, not individuals. But when you're going up against us, we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against systems. And systems do not come down by being challenged by well-behaved people. It is people who will speak truth and people who will take the knocks and get back up again and try another way. And that is, I think, what it means to be a trailblazer, to be the first of one's generation, to ask difficult questions, and to be willing to be not chosen.
I want to close with the remarks, since writing is such an important part of your ministry, and what Toni Morrison said at James Baldwin's funeral. She said, you gave us a language to dwell in. This is a paraphrase, that was so natural to us that we thought it was our own. You have given us a language
to dwell in.
To dwell in. And with language, we can speak, we can do, we can. So just thank you so much for all of the stuff you've gone through, and I appreciate you, and thank you for doing this interview. It's going to bless many people. I'm telling you, it's going to bless.
I hope so. Thank you.
Bless you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.